Gen Z is doing something weird. They are the most tech-dependent generation in history. You would expect them to go for tech watches, like the Apple Watch, or is currently lining up to own a mechanical object from the 1950s that cannot send a text, track a step, or predict rain. And somehow, that is exactly the point, the world they grew up in. Picture 2020. A 20-year-old is 3 months into the pandemic. She's taking remote classes from a childhood bedroom, watching her older sister's service job evaporate, reading about a stock market crash that bounced back so fast it felt like a hallucination. Her phone tells her the time. Her laptop tells her the time. The microwave, the TV, the little display in the corner of her laptop screen. All of it tells her the time. She doesn't need a watch. But she starts looking at one anyway. Not because she's nostalgic. She's 20. She doesn't have nostalgia. She starts looking at a Rolex because something on TikTok told her it was real, tangible, built to outlast the software update that would brick her phone in 3 years. This is the part most people get wrong about Gen Z and Rolex. Everyone assumes it's about status, about flaunting, about that specific kind of social media peacocking where you angle your wrist into a shot to make sure the crown logo catches the light. Some of it is. We'll get to that. But underneath the flex culture, there's something much stranger and more interesting going on. Gen Z didn't fall in love with Rolex despite being the most digital generation alive. They fell in love with Rolex because of it. Before we get to why Rolex specifically won, it helps to understand the world these buyers actually grew up in. The iPhone arrived in 2007. Anyone born from 1997 onward entered their teenage years in a world where the smartphone was already default. Not a novelty, not an upgrade. Just the baseline. Every watch these kids could see was already on their phone. The wristwatch had been functionally dead as a utility object before most of them turned 13. So why wear one at all? That question sounds simple. The answer took the entire watch industry by surprise. The object that doesn't rot. There's a piece of research worth reading. Post-COVID behavioral studies, published between 2021 and 2024, found what researchers called a tangible objects reaction in young consumers who had spent extended periods in digital-only environments. The longer someone lived through screens, the more they valued physical objects with weight, craft, and permanence. Gen Z was the lab rat for this experiment at the exact moment they had money to spend. Daehin Lee runs Taya Collective, a vintage watch shop with over 10,000 Instagram followers. She told CNN in early 2026 that over 45% of her audience is Gen Z. Her explanation was direct. They grew up in this highly digital environment. It seems to me that it only intensified their desire for tactile and tangible objects. That tracks with what the data shows. Chrono24 reported in 2024 that buyers aged 18 to 28 were the fastest growing segment on their platform year over year. The Federation of the Swiss watch industry confirmed entry-level Swiss exports held up even as the broader luxury market faced headwinds. Tudor waitlists now include buyers in their early 20s who saved for months with the same discipline they once applied to sneaker drops. Seiko's prospects and presage lines sell out within hours of restocks. The pre-owned market for entry Omegas, particularly the Seamaster 300M, has compressed in age. Sellers are increasingly people in their 30s, upgrading. Buyers are increasingly people in their early 20s, buying their first. Honestly, this part still surprises me every time I look at it. You'd expect the generation that grew up with everything digital to just not care, but the opposite happened. The Submariner doesn't need a software update. That line, half joke, half thesis, went viral in watch collector spaces around 2022, and it crystallized something real. Gen Z didn't just want something physical. They wanted something that would still be exactly the same object in 20 years. In a world of planned obsolescence, that felt almost radical. But this still doesn't explain why Rolex specifically. There are plenty of things that don't need software updates. A brick, a hammer, a vintage Seiko. Something else was happening. The tangible object story is real, but it only explains part of the love affair. The other part is uglier and more honest. Proof you're winning anyway. Let's talk about what Gen Z actually inherited. Student debt that took years to recover from, inflation that made a bag of groceries feel like a decision, Housing prices are so disconnected from income that the idea of owning anything became a running joke in the comment sections of finance TikTok. A job market that oscillated between "we're all hiring" and "we're doing layoffs" so fast that stability stopped feeling like a reasonable expectation. Older generations bought Rolex after stability. After the promotion, after the mortgage, after the kids were in school, the watch was a reward, a capstone, something you bought when you had finally made it. Gen Z didn't have that order of events. They discovered Rolex during the instability, which means the watch stopped being a reward and started being something more psychologically interesting. Proof that you were surviving anyway in the middle of a crazy mess, not retirement success. Visible survival success. The kind that photographs well and signals to anyone watching your stories that you are not, in fact, drowning. This is where the sports models dominate. The Submariner, the GMT Master 2, the Daytona. None of these are dress watches. They're built for movement, for function, for people who go places and do things. They look durable in a way that a slim dress watch doesn't. They signal doing, not arrived. And critically, they photograph in one frame. No explanation needed. The crown logo and the bezel do the work before the caption even loads. A Long and Sewn build a more technically impressive watch. Breguet invented the tourbillon. But a 23-year-old scrolling Instagram doesn't have 2 minutes to explain what a tourbillon is. They have 1 frame and a half second of attention. Rolex wins that game every time. The Watch You Seek community noticed this shift around 2021. Forum members started documenting what they called the first Rolex demographic. Buyers in their mid-20s who had saved specifically and deliberately for the Sub or the GMT, with no existing watch collection, no watch nerd context, no interest in movements. They just wanted the thing. Not because it kept better time than anything else. Because it kept better time than anything else and everyone in the room knew what it was. One Watch You Seek thread from late 2021 has over 300 replies and starts with a simple question. Is it weird that I bought a Sub and I still don't know what caliber is inside it? The replies split roughly in half between people who found this offensive and people who understood it completely. That split tells you everything about the generational fault line in watch collecting right now. Recognition. That's the word that keeps coming up, and it points to something that none of the competitor brands have quite solved. Omega has the Moonwatch, Grand Seiko has the Spring Drive. Tudor has done everything right in terms of value and craft. But ask someone who has never thought about watches to name a luxury watch brand, and most of the time they say Rolex. Not because Rolex makes the best movements. Because Rolex has been in the cultural air so long that the name itself is the product. But recognition alone doesn't explain what happened in 2020 and 2021. Something in the market cracked open that year, and a lot of young people got burned by it. The asset lie, and what it actually taught people. This is the chapter nobody tells cleanly. Around 2021, the secondary market for luxury watches did something it had never done before at that speed or scale. Prices spiked. The Submariner, which had been hovering around $9,000 at retail with modest gray market premiums, started trading at $14,000, $15,000, $18,000. The Daytona had always commanded premiums, but by 2021, it was flirting with $30,000. The GMT Master 2 Pepsi, which Rolex had only put back into steel production in 2018, was trading at 2.5 times retail within 3 years of its reintroduction. And TikTok finance culture noticed. The content machine that had been explaining crypto and sneaker flipping turned its attention to watches. Buy a Rolex and you might make money, became the message. Not just hold value, make money. Suddenly, a purchase that cost $15,000 didn't feel like spending. It felt like investing. The guilt dissolved. You weren't treating yourself. You were being strategically smart. Gen Z loved this framing because it fit the way they already thought. They were the sneaker resell generation. They understood buying low and selling high. The idea that a physical object could function like an asset wasn't foreign to them. They'd watched people flip Jordans for profit on StockX since they were 15. So they bought watches with a logic previous generations never used. And for a while, the logic worked. Then it stopped working. By 2023, secondary prices began correcting hard from their 2020 highs. The speculative buyers, the ones who'd bought 3 Submariners as investment vehicles with no attachment to the watches themselves, started to exit. prices dropped. Not to pre-pandemic levels, but far enough that anyone who bought at the peak was holding a watch worth considerably less than what they'd paid. Watch Charts and Morgan Stanley tracked the correction in detail. The secondary market's overall value, which had been extraordinary through the hype cycle, pulled back and stayed subdued through 2023 and into 2024. Here's what's interesting, and this is the thing most narratives miss. Gen Z didn't leave. The speculative buyers left, the flippers left, but the buyers who had wanted a Rolex and rationalized it as an investment. Most of them looked at the watch on their wrist, shrugged, and decided they still liked it. The asset framing had been a psychological permission slip, not the actual reason. The actual reason was deeper, which means the investment argument, even when it was disproven, had done its job. It had gotten a generation of young buyers into the market. And once they were in, they stayed for reasons that had nothing to do with resale charts. By 2025, the Chrono 24 and Fratello H1 report confirmed what the community had been watching. Rolex had normalized. 33.7% secondary market share, still the dominant player. But back to fundamentals, genuine collector demand replacing speculative trading. And the buyers sustaining that demand? Younger than they'd ever been. The speculative bubble popped. Gen Z stayed. What they were actually buying had never been an investment. It was something older than that. The mythology machine. Rolex has been building a story for 70 years, and they did not build it accidentally. The watch that summited Everest in 1953. The Submariner, worn by James Bond in Dr. No. Not as a prop, as a character detail. Something the production chose specifically because it communicated exactly the right thing about the man wearing it. Paul Newman's Daytona, which sold at Phillips in 2017 for $17.7 million, making it at the time the most expensive wristwatch ever sold at auction. The detail that made that sale land so hard: Newman had worn it daily. It had scratches. The bezel had faded. It wasn't pristine. It was used. And someone paid $17.7 million for a used watch because the story behind the use was worth more than the condition. That's the mythology machine at its most efficient. Roger Federer, Tiger Woods, and now, at the front end of the Gen Z era, Carlos Alcaraz. Alcaraz signed with Rolex in January 2022 at 19 years old. He was, at that point, already on his way to becoming the youngest world number 1 in ATP history. What Rolex recognized wasn't just talent, it was generational resonance. Alcaraz plays with a visible joy that older champions had trained out of themselves. He reacts, he laughs mid-match. He looks actually surprised when he does something brilliant. For a generation that values authenticity above almost everything, he reads as real. At the 2025 Roland Garros final, something worth stopping on happened. Alcaraz and Jannik Sinner, both 22 and 23, both Rolex testimonies, played a 5-set final that had the tennis world barely breathing. When it ended, both players reached into their bags and strapped on their Rolexes before the trophy ceremony. Not later, before. Alcaraz wore a yellow-gold Daytona with a turquoise lacquer dial. Sinner wore an Everose gold Daytona on Oysterflex. Two of the most watched young athletes in the world, voluntarily putting on mechanical watches before a broadcast moment that would reach hundreds of millions of people. Rolex couldn't have scripted it better. And they didn't have to. But the mythology machine isn't just about ambassadors, it's about scarcity. The waitlist, specifically the way Rolex manages it, does something psychologically sophisticated that Gen Z's sneaker culture had already trained them to understand. The waitlist doesn't just create exclusivity. It creates a community of people who almost have the thing. That community is almost as valuable as the owners themselves. The conversations on Watch You Seek and Watch Crunch and the Reddit forums aren't just people who own Submariners. They're mostly people who want one and are talking themselves into the wait. That audience is enormous, and it converts over time. When the Pepsi GMT Master 2, the iconic blue and red bezel reference, disappeared from Rolex's catalog at Watches and Wonders in April 2026, pre-owned prices surged past $30,000 almost immediately. No announcement, no press release. The watch just stopped appearing on the website. Authorized dealers who'd had wait lists for the thing for years suddenly had nothing to offer their clients. The Pepsi had retailed at $11,800. The gap between what something costs and what people will pay to own it is one of the cleanest measures of desire we have. Gen Z grew up watching that gap operate in sneakers. They understand it intuitively. And Rolex does it better than anyone. The mythology, the ambassadors, the waitlist, none of it would work if something hadn't shifted about what luxury means to a 23-year-old in 2026. That shift is the most underreported part of this whole story. The quiet luxury pivot nobody saw coming. Here's a fact that should have been obvious in retrospect and wasn't. Gen Z is not buying the same Rolex their parents wanted. The brief assumed Gen Z was gravitating toward the heavy sports models, the big Submariner, the GMT, the Daytona. And that was true in 2020 and 2021 during the hype cycle. Those models announced themselves. They were status in its most direct form. But the Chrono 24 and Fratello H1 2025 report showed something different. Gen Z buyers, already the fastest growing segment on the platform, were accelerating toward dress watches, slimmer, smaller, often vintage. The number of classic dress watch purchases by buyers aged 14 to 28 had risen 44% since 2018. The Datejust, the watch your grandfather wore to Sunday lunch and your uncle wore to the office for decades, is now the most popular reference in the Rolex secondary market. Full stop. Not the Submariner, the Datejust. The case size preference has shifted too. The era of the 41mm bezel-heavy sports watch is cooling. Gen Z is reaching for 36mm references, sometimes smaller. These fit differently. They sit lower on the wrist, they work with slim-cut clothing, they don't fight for visual attention the way a bigger case does. They look better in the kind of wrist-check content that drives watch culture on Instagram now. There's something happening here beyond aesthetics. The quiet luxury movement turned Loro Piana into a meme and made the Cartier Tank the most discussed watch on fashion TikTok 2 years running. That's not a coincidence. Gen Z grew up watching loud luxury fail. They watched the fast fashion boom collapse under its own contradiction. They watched the peak streetwear moment pass and leave a lot of people holding expensive items that looked embarrassing 6 months later. What lasts? What ages well? What still looks right in 10 years? The answers to those questions keep coming back to the same things: natural materials, classic proportions, heritage without noise. Rolex fits. And within Rolex, the quieter references fit more than the loud ones. This is the part where I'll say something that might be uncomfortable. Cartier is the biggest beneficiary of exactly this shift. Among Gen Z, on Chrono 2-4, Cartier's market share has risen from 1.7% to 6.8% over 7 years. A fourfold increase driven almost entirely by younger buyers gravitating toward the Tank and the Santos Dumont. These are watches that most 40-year-old collectors had written off as costume jewelry. Gen Z is treating them as the next grails. But Rolex is still at 33.7% of the secondary market. And the Datejust, quiet, classic, unchanged in its essential character for decades, is still what people keep coming back to. The generation that grew up watching everything change faster than they could track decided they wanted something that doesn't change. Go figure. And then there's the money side. The prices that went up, the tariffs, the currency moves, because the economic reality of buying a Rolex in 2026 has gotten properly complicated. The economic reality in 2026. This part matters if you're a buyer right now, and it's worth understanding even if you're not. In January 2026, Rolex implemented its 4th consecutive year of price increases. Steel models went up between 1% and 6%, depending on the reference. The no-date Submariner crossed the $10,000 retail threshold for the first time in history. Gold models saw increases between 6% and 9%. But American buyers got hit twice. The 15% import tariff on Swiss watches is a result of the U.S. administration's 2025 trade policy. It was eventually negotiated down from 39%, but even that effectively amplified every price increase. Add 12% dollar weakness against the Swiss franc over the previous year, and U.S. buyers are paying a compounding premium that European buyers simply don't face. The steel Daytona that retailed at $16,000 at the start of 2025 is $16,900 by 2026 before the tariff multiplier. Gray market pricing operates independently of those retail figures, driven by supply and demand rather than list prices. The gap between what an authorized dealer charges and what a gray market dealer charges has actually narrowed on some references, which creates a strange dynamic where the gray market, traditionally the more expensive option for sports models, is starting to look rational. For Gen Z buyers who got into the market with an investment framing, 2026 is a test of whether they actually wanted the watch or whether they wanted the financial story. Rising retail prices don't help resale premiums automatically. Secondary market data from Morgan Stanley and Watch Charts shows a gentle recovery through 2025 and into early 2026. But it's a measured climb, not a return to pandemic fever. What it has produced is a cleaner buyer. The collector who saves for 2 years and buys a Datejust because they like the Datejust is a fundamentally different person from the speculative buyer who treated 3 Submariners as an ETF. The market settled, and the people left in it are, on balance, more serious about the actual objects. That's not a bad thing for the long run. But it does mean the Rolex as investment conversation that convinced a lot of young buyers to enter the market in the first place has complicated itself considerably. The honest version of the asset argument in 2026 is narrower. Certain discontinued references have demonstrated genuine appreciation and extremely limited downside. For most in-production steel sports models, the secondary market price premium above retail is real, but it's not a guaranteed gain, it's a cost of access. Understanding that difference is the gap between a collector and someone who got sold a story. So here's the real question. Not whether Rolex is a good investment, whether it matters. Before we move on to the next part, let me tell you this. Most people don't realize this, but buying a watch the wrong way can cost you thousands, and you won't even notice it until it's too late. You walk into a store or browse online, and everything looks the same, but behind the scenes, there's a system. Prices aren't always fair, availability is controlled, and one bad decision can leave you overpaying for something that doesn't even hold its value. That's why I created a complete free insider guide to buying watches. Inside, you'll find the best watches to buy, the watches to avoid, and how to choose a watch that actually fits your style and budget long term. The goal is simple. I'll help you stop guessing and start buying smart. You'll find the free guide in the pinned comment and description. Now, let's move on to the next part, what they're actually buying. Let me tell you about a different 20-year-old. He's in 2022. He's been on a waiting list for 8 months at an authorized dealer for a Submariner date. He checks in every few weeks. He's read every thread on WatchUseek about whether the black dial or the blue is the right call. He knows the reference number. He knows the movement, the caliber 3235, the 70-hour power reserve, the Chronergy escapement. He knows more about this object than he knows about anything he owns. He gets the call in November. He goes in. He puts it on his wrist in the store, and for about 30 seconds, he doesn't say anything. Not because it's beautiful, though it is. Because it's permanent in a way nothing else in his life has felt. This isn't going to be rendered obsolete in 18 months. It's not going to be discontinued by the manufacturer and stop receiving support. It's not going to get slow and glitchy and eventually just not turn on one day. He can have this serviced in 20 years, and it will run exactly as it does today. The movement, the caliber, 3235, doesn't know there's an internet. It doesn't know what year it is. It just runs. If you felt something like that about an object you own, something that just feels made in a way most things aren't, drop it in the comments. I'm curious whether it's generational or something else entirely. There's something underneath the status and the investment and the social media performance, something that almost never gets said out loud, is that Gen Z bought permanence. In a world where the average smartphone lasts 3 years, the average social media platform reshapes itself every 18 months, the average job lasts less than 3 years for someone under 25, and the cultural conversation moves so fast that yesterday's reference is tomorrow's cringe. They bought something that doesn't move. The Crown doesn't update its operating system. The Crown doesn't deprecate features. The Crown doesn't announce a new model and makes you feel like your old one is embarrassing. The Crown just runs. And in 2026, that is an unusual thing to be able to say about something that costs what a Rolex costs. This is the observation that's hardest to find in any marketing material or analyst report. Rolex is the anti-technology product for the most technological generation. Not because Gen Z hates technology, they don't. Because they've lived inside technology long enough to understand what it costs, the subscription, the upgrade cycle, the planned obsolescence. The way the algorithm learns what makes you anxious and shows you more of it. A mechanical watch doesn't know anything about you, it just runs. And for a generation that has been known, tracked, targeted, and served content by machines since before they could drive, that anonymity is something close to a luxury in itself. Why Rolex specifically? So, why not Omega? Why not Grand Seiko? Why not the Seiko SARB 033 that Watch You Seek has been calling underrated for 15 years? 3 things. And only one of them is about watchmaking. The first one, recognition. Rolex is the only watch brand that exists in the consciousness of people who have never thought about watches. You could show a Submariner to someone who has never once looked at a watch enthusiast forum and they would know what it is. That's 70 years of cultural embedding. Through sports sponsorship, through cinema, through the simple fact that Rolex has been on the wrists of enough powerful people for long enough that the brand itself carries a meaning independent of the watches. For a generation that communicates in cultural shorthand and whose social media presence is read in seconds, not minutes, that recognition is not a small thing. It's the whole game. Second, scarcity as a feature. Every young person who has ever waited on a sneaker drop understands what Rolex is doing with its production strategy. They produce approximately 1 million watches a year against demand that could absorb several times that figure. They don't announce shortages, they don't apologize for wait lists. They simply do not make enough, and they do it deliberately, and everyone knows it. The waitlist is not an inconvenience. The waitlist is the product. It creates a cohort of people who are emotionally invested in the brand before they own a single piece. When they finally do get the call from the authorized dealer, the first watch they buy carries the weight of everything they've learned and wanted in the months of waiting. It's not just a purchase, it's a conclusion. Third, the mythology has never stopped compounding. Every year, something happens in the Rolex story. Alcaraz and Sinner at Roland Garros 2025. The Pepsi GMT disappearing from the catalog in April 2026 with no replacement. The Centenary Oyster Perpetual with the first reference to carry the updated superlative chronometer certification. Rolex has been generating watch content since before watch content was a category, and the supply of meaningful moments has not dried up. Compare that to a brand like Grand Seiko. The movements are extraordinary. The dials are, honestly, some of the most beautiful objects in the watch industry. But you cannot tell the Grand Seiko story in one frame. You cannot show someone a spring drive on TikTok and have the cultural context land automatically. It requires explanation. Rolex does not require explanation. That's not a knock on Grand Seiko. It's an observation about what Gen Z values. And why the brand that has spent 7 decades building name recognition with people who have never thought about watches ends up winning the generation that communicates in cultural shorthand. The dark side nobody talks about. There are Gen Z buyers making monthly payments on watches they can't afford in order to look like they can. This is not a small number. Financing luxury goods through personal loans or credit is not new. People have been doing it with cars and handbags for decades. But the specific dynamic of financing a watch specifically because it photographs well, specifically because it anchors a certain kind of social media identity, is something that the watch community on WatchCrunch and Reddit has been uncomfortable discussing openly. The formula is simple and recognizable. A person sees a watch on someone they respect, associates the watch with the lifestyle they want. So, the person buys the watch as a shorthand for that lifestyle, discovers that the watch didn't actually bring the lifestyle, but keeps the watch because removing it would mean admitting the purchase was about someone else's validation, not their own. Rolex stopped being a product for this person. It became identity armor. And identity armor creates a specific kind of emotional dependency. The watch has to keep working as a signal, which means the person has to keep signaling, which means the watch is load-bearing in a way no physical object should be. There's a name for the person on the other side of this transaction. The watch community calls them ADs, authorized dreamers, not authorized dealers. People who buy the ticket to the club before they can afford the membership. The forums have seen enough of them to recognize the pattern. Buy early, overpay, struggle quietly, eventually sell below what they paid, disappear from the community. None of this is Rolex's fault, but it's part of the Gen Z Rolex story that the first Rolex content doesn't show. Here's what I've landed on after looking at all of this. Gen Z didn't fall in love with Rolex because they're superficial. They fell in love with Rolex because they're the first generation to grow up surrounded by things designed to break, be replaced, and be forgotten. They recognized in a 70-year-old Swiss mechanical object something most of their possessions couldn't offer. The investment framing got them through the door. The status signaling kept them talking about it. But what kept them in was something simpler. The watch will still be there. In a world that restarts every 18 months, that is not a small thing. Whether the belief is entirely rational almost doesn't matter anymore. Culturally, Gen Z already decided it is. And once a generation decides something is worth wanting, the market follows. It always does. And the most expensive decision you can make is deciding that something truly permanent is worth buying in an impermanent world. If you've ever stood in a store holding a watch that resonated with you, let me know what that watch is. I want to know what it was. If this video gave you something, you know what to do with the like button. And subscribe if you want the next one when it's ready. I'm building something with this channel, and I hope you'll be on the ride with me.